As the European countries began to go through the Renaissance and the Reformation, which changed their way of thinking about things, as well as the voyages of discovery, which expanded their horizons and connected them with empires all across the globe, there was also another change within Europe, and that is a move towards more centralized governments. This allowed power to shift from the southern part of Europe to the northern part of Europe, as well as the eastern part of Europe as well, who also developed a form of absolute government. There are typically two forms of government that developed at this time, and that is absolutism and constitutional government. Now, both forms of government took shape slightly differently in different parts of Europe. Absolutism took hold on the continent more than in anywhere else in Europe. The French in Western Europe really epitomize what absolutism is all about, especially under the King Louis XIV, who had one of the longest reigns in all of European history. Absolutism in Western Europe looked slightly differently than absolutism in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, we see absolute government or absolute monarchy develop in Prussia, which will later become Germany in the 19th century, Russia, different from Prussia, and Austria as well. The other form of government is constitutional government, and the epitome of a constitutional government at this time is England. The Dutch Republic also develops a form of constitutional government, and you'll read about that in your textbook. It's slightly different than the English. One of the things I want you to pay attention to as you're looking at these forms of government and how they develop is the differences in the geographic locations and what accounted for those differences. Why did absolutism look different in Western Europe than it did in Eastern Europe? Why does constitutional government develop differently in England than it does in the Netherlands? I want to briefly touch on now the key elements of absolute government and constitutional government. There are really 5 elements of absolutism that you can identify, oh, this is an absolute state. The first is that they had a king who believed that they had a divine right to rule. The divine right to rule said that their power, the power of the king, came directly from God, and as such they did not have to answer to anyone other than God. They did not have to answer to the people of their country at all. The second important characteristic is that they had a centralized government where everything reported back to the king. And the power of the nobility was lessened at this time. We are coming out of a time in European history when feudal monarchies existed, and during feudal monarchies, local nobles had a good amount of power that they shared loosely with the king. In absolute monarchy, the king is supreme and the nobles' power is weakened. The government structure that develops, the bureaucracy, reports to the king, not to the local nobles. You also see standing armies typically coming into play at this time. Prior to this, and standing armies that are loyal to the king. Prior to this, armies were called upon when needed. They were called upon by their local nobles who would raise a battalion or a part of the army that would then go fight for the king. They were not paid. These were farmers by day, soldiers by night, essentially. And they would oftentimes live off the land, which was very detrimental to for any war that was fought in Europe. Now we're seeing the development of standing armies. These are professional trained soldiers. They get paid a salary. They enlist for a certain number of years. They have uniforms. They start to begin to have standardized weaponry. And it makes makes things much more efficient in Europe as far as wars go. We also see a centralized banking system because you have to have money to run a government. So we see the economy being centralized for the benefit of the state, and that takes shape in different forms in different areas. And then the final thing that you typically see in an absolutist state is that you will see somehow they deal with religion, because post-Reformation we now see a number of different religions taking shape in Europe. And so the king typically will decide this is the religion of the state and this is the religion that everyone must follow. Now, a constitutional government is defined essentially as a government that is limited by law. Now, in England, for example, they develop a constitutional monarchy. So they still had a king or a queen, but the power of the king or the queen was not absolute as it was in an absolute monarchy. In a constitutional monarchy, the king or queen shares their power with some form of representative body that represents the needs and desires of the people. Now keep in mind that a constitutional monarchy, especially at this time, is not the same as a democracy. All of the people were not represented in Parliament in England. In fact, there were many of the people who were not represented at all. The people at this time that were represented in Parliament were the wealthy landowning people. They were the ones who had a say in the government. So it was far from a democracy at this time. But there is an understanding in constitutional government that the power of the executive leader, whether it be an elected official or a monarch, was not absolute, was not total, that those people were responsible, yes, to God in their personal life probably, but more importantly, they were responsible to the people that they governed. And if they didn't respond to the people that they governed, then we see civil wars breaking out. In England, they have a civil war from 1642 to 1649, after which Charles I loses his head. He is tried for treason, and then the people establish essentially a little after that, after a little more bloodshed and problems, they ultimately develop a constitutional monarchy.